The Weight of the Trident, Part 1. The setup. The report was 12 pages long. Rear Admiral Ruth Calloway had read thousands of after-action reports in her 34 years of service. Most of them she could skim in 4 minutes. Most of them said what she already expected. This one made her stop on page 3. She was sitting in her office at Naval Station, Norfolk, Virginia, 72 hours after the events at Fort Carson, Colorado. Outside her window, the Atlantic was gray and flat. Inside, the only sound was the ventilation system and the quiet turning of a page. She found the line she was looking for. Obstacle course completion time, 2 minutes, 4 seconds. She read it again. Then she looked at the footnote the duty officer had attached because duty officers at her level were trained to flag anomalies. The footnote said, previous base record, Fort Carson North course, 2 minutes, 47 seconds. Said October 14th, 1997. Master Chief Thomas Voss, SEAL Team 3. Calloway set the report down on her desk. She looked at her aide, a young lieutenant commander named Briggs who had been standing near the door for the past 20 minutes, saying nothing because he had learned that silence was what she required when she read. She said Thomas Voss's record. Briggs said, yes, ma'am. She said, his daughter. It wasn't a question. Briggs nodded anyway. Calloway picked up the report again. She turned back to page 1 and started over from the beginning, this time reading every word. Because some stories deserve that. Fort Carson sits at the edge of Colorado Springs, pressed against the base of Pikes Peak, like something that grew there naturally out of rock and altitude, and the kind of silence that only military installations carry at 5 in the morning. The mountain doesn't care who commands the post. It was there before the first barracks went up in 1942, and it will be there long after the last one comes down. At an elevation of 5,800 feet, the air is thinner than most people expect. First-timers notice it in the legs. Veterans notice it in everything else. Colonel Frank Hargrove had commanded Fort Carson's elite tactical leadership program for 3 years, 2 months, and 11 days. He kept count because counting things gave him the feeling of ownership over them. He owned this post the way certain men own rooms they walk into. Not through title, though he had that too. Through presence. Through the understanding shared by everyone around him that the cost of disagreement was higher than the cost of compliance. He was 54 years old. He had never seen combat in the traditional sense. No Fallujah, no Kandahar, no streets where the buildings shot back. His career had been built in conference rooms and evaluation boards, in the corridors of institutions where the real battles were fought with paperwork and patience, and the careful cultivation of people who owed you something. He was good at that kind of war. The soldiers under his command knew what kind of man he was. They knew it the way soldiers always know, not from a single incident, but from the accumulation of small moments. The way he spoke to Junior enlisted in front of their peers. The way he smiled when someone made a mistake. The way the room changed when he entered it, shoulders pulling inward, eyes dropping to the floor. Everyone becoming slightly less than they had been a moment before. 3 weeks before the morning, Sloan Voss walked through the doors of Building 7. Hargrove had dressed down a 23-year-old sergeant named Alvarez in the main corridor of the administrative building, in front of 14 people. For a paperwork error, for 7 minutes. Nobody said anything. That was the part that stayed. Not what Hargrove said, what the 14 people around him chose not to say. Sloan Voss had read the incident report on Alvarez before she boarded her flight out of Virginia Beach. She read it on a tablet in a middle seat somewhere over Ohio with the window shade down and the overhead light off and the man next to her asleep against the fuselage. She read it twice. Then she closed the tablet and looked at the seat back in front of her for a long time. She had volunteered for this assignment. Rear Admiral Calloway had given her the option of formal offer, not an order, because Calloway understood the difference between the two. The mission was straightforward on paper travel to Fort Carson under a provisional alias, present herself as an applicant for the elite tactical leadership program, and document the behavior of senior personnel during the evaluation process. Her real file would be sealed. Her uniform would carry no name tape. She would be to everyone in that building exactly what she appeared to be, a transfer of unknown origin, requesting entry into a program that had never accepted a woman. Calloway had said, you don't have to do this. Sloan had said, I know. Then she had signed the assignment papers. She was 27 years old, 5 feet 3 inches tall, 118 pounds. She had a face that looked younger than her age and gray eyes that did not. And she had learned a long time ago that the combination of those two things made people underestimate her before she opened her mouth, which she had long since stopped trying to correct. She had been a Navy SEAL for 8 years. That was not a sentence most people processed correctly the first time. The United States Navy's SEAL program does not recruit from a wide pool. It recruits from a pool of candidates who have already survived the preliminary screening, the PST, the physical readiness test, and then it invites them to BUD/S basic underwater demolition/SEAL training, where the attrition rate hovers, depending on the class, between 70 and 80%. Most candidates who make it to BUD/S do not make it through. The ones who do go on to SEAL qualification training, followed by assignment to a team, followed by years of workups and deployments in the grinding accumulation of operational experience that separates the credential from the competence. Sloan had done all of it. She had done it beginning at age 19 after her first application at 18 was rejected by an evaluation board that included among its voting members a colonel named Frank Hargrove, who had looked at her across a table at Naval Station Coronado and said, with the certainty of a man who had never been wrong about anything, in a room where no one could correct him, "Thomas Voss's daughter doesn't belong here." She had found out about that sentence 4 years later, from a letter her father had written and never sent, discovered in a shoebox under his bed 3 weeks after his funeral. She had been standing in his bedroom in Pensacola, still in the dark dress from the burial heels in her hand, because she had taken them off on the porch steps and not put them back on. She read it once. Then she sat down on the edge of his bed and held the paper for a long time without reading it again. 4 years. He had known for 4 years and said nothing. Not on the drive back from Coronado that day. Not during her second application cycle. Not when she called him from Coronado after BUD/S, or from her first deployment, or from any of the places the job had taken her in the years between that evaluation board and the morning he died. He had carried it alone, which was what he did with everything he believed was his to carry and not hers. That was the kind of man Thomas Voss had been. She had volunteered for this mission because of Alvarez. That was the true answer, the one underneath the professional language of the assignment papers. Because the system that had produced Hargrove's 7 minutes in that corridor was the same system that, left unexamined, produced much worse than 7 minutes. She had watched it produce worse. She had stood at a gravesite in Virginia Beach 18 months ago and understood that the man in the casket had died in a training accident that was not entirely an accident, that there had been a chain of decisions made by people who believed their authority insulated them from consequence. She had signed the papers because someone had to, because she was the right person to, because she was, if she was honest with herself, the only person in Callaway's roster who had a reason to be in that building that went beyond the professional. Her mother had called the night before departure. Her mother said, "Be careful." Sloan said, "I will, I'm home." Her mother said, "Come home the same person you left as." That was the second promise. The one made after the funeral, because grief changes people, and her mother had watched enough people change in ways they couldn't come back from. Sloan had made it without hesitation, meaning it fully knowing even then that the keeping of it would require something from her on most days. The first promise was her father's. He had said it to her once when she was 20 and home on leave between her first and second workup cycles, sitting on the back porch of the house in Pensacola watching the bay go dark. He said it without preamble, the way he said everything that mattered, as if the thought had been waiting for the right moment and had simply decided this was it. He said, "The skills are a tool. Tools don't have a conscience. That's your job." She asked him what he meant. He said, "Never use them against someone who doesn't deserve it, even when you could, especially when you could." She said she understood. She had not fully understood until later, until the first time she was in a situation where she could and didn't, and felt the weight of that restraint. Not the restraint itself, the weight of it. The conscious, deliberate act of choosing not to, when choosing not to cost you something. The exit for Fort Carson appeared on the right. She took it. Building 7 was a rectangular structure of poured concrete and institutional lighting that smelled like floor wax and recycled air, and the staleness of a place where the windows don't open. Sloan checked in at the front desk with her alias credentials. Claire Merritt, a name chosen for its unremarkability, received a temporary badge and was directed down a corridor to the evaluation briefing room. She walked slowly, not because she was uncertain of the direction, because she was cataloging. 2 corporals moving equipment near the south door, one of whom favored his left leg slightly. A bulletin board with a printed memo dated 3 weeks ago, the edges already curling. No one had replaced it, which meant either no one monitored it or no one cared. A water stain on the ceiling tile outside the second door on the left, the pattern suggesting a recurring leak, rather than a single incident, which meant a maintenance report had been submitted and not acted on, or not submitted at all. Small things. Sloan collected small things. Her father had taught her that the periphery was where you found the truth of a place. Anyone could arrange the center of a room. The edges were where the real information lived. She pushed open the door to the evaluation briefing room. 11 people inside. She counted them in the first 2 seconds without appearing to count. 3 stood near the windows on the east wall. 4 were seated at the central table. 2 were positioned near the far door, and those 2 she clocked immediately as the ones to watch most closely. They stood with the stillness of men performing observation rather than doing it. One man stood at the front of the room with his hands clasped behind his back. Colonel Frank Hargrove. He was taller than his file photograph suggested. Gray at the temples, which was new. The most recent photo she had was 18 months old. His uniform was immaculate in the way that requires effort, the look of a man who has someone maintain things for him, a look she recognized by its specific absence of self-consciousness. He was scanning her from the moment she entered, not subtly. Standing slightly to Hargrove's left, Sergeant First Class Vic Dolan, 38 years old, 14 years of service, including 2 tours in Afghanistan with the 10th Mountain Division and 1 advisory role in a Special Operations Task Force whose specific designation had been redacted in the unclassified version of his file. 3 commendations and 1 letter of reprimand from 2019 for what the file described as insubordinate conduct during a command review, which translated in Sloan's experience to a man who had told someone above him something true that the someone above him did not want to hear. She respected that without showing it. Dolan's eyes went to her hands when she entered the room. Not her face, not her uniform, her hands. Hands told a different story than faces, and he knew it. Her hands told a story she wasn't trying to hide exactly. She just wasn't announcing it. Near the back of the room, almost against the wall, stood a younger man who had positioned himself at an angle, giving him a sight line to both doors and the window simultaneously. Corporal Dex Harlow, 25 years old. His file was thin because he was young, and thin files on young soldiers either meant nothing had happened yet or meant the things that had happened weren't in the file. He was watching her the way she was watching the room, not performing attention, but actually paying it. She filed that away. The other man she noted, Lieutenant Craig Pelham, standing just behind Hargrove's right shoulder, where you stood when your job was to execute rather than decide. 31 years old, built like a man who spent time in the gym so other men would notice. His file described him as Hargrove's adjutant. In practice, Sloan suspected it described something closer to instrument. Hargrove let her stand in the doorway for 3 seconds before acknowledging her. Those 3 seconds were not accidental. "You're the applicant," he said. His voice carried the whole room without effort. A voice trained for institutional acoustics for the performance of authority in front of an audience. "Yes, sir," Sloan said. She kept her hands behind her back. Her voice came out, level, unhurried, carrying nothing that would give him anything to work with. Hargrove walked toward her slowly, the way men walk when they believe the movement itself is an assertion. He stopped at a distance slightly closer than the situation required. "What's your background?" he asked. "Transfer, sir. Evaluation pending program admission." "That's not what I asked." "That's what my file says, sir." A short silence. Around the room, she felt the 11 people adjusting the collective recalibration that happens when someone does not behave the way a room has learned to expect. Hargrove smiled. It didn't reach his eyes. "You don't look like much," he said. He said it casually. The way you say something you've said before, something you know lands something you've had practice delivering in the same tone, to the same effect. Sloan didn't respond. Pelham made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. Dolan, she noticed in her peripheral vision, did not. "You're supposed to lead advanced tactical units." Hargrove continued, circling slightly to her right. "That's what this program produces, leaders, men who can make decisions in environments where mistakes are measured in body bags." He paused. "You understand what that means?" "Yes, sir." "Do you?" He stopped moving. "Did you request this assignment, or did someone send you because they needed a number to fill a slot?" The question had a shape she recognized, designed to produce 2 answers, both of them wrong. If she said she requested it, he would call it arrogance. If she said she was assigned, he would call it weakness. "I volunteered," she said, "for this specific program." "Yes, sir." He looked at her for a moment longer than was comfortable, and she let the discomfort exist without trying to fill it. Then Hargrove nodded at the uniform she was wearing. His voice dropped half a register, the register of a man who has decided to demonstrate something in front of an audience and is now performing for that audience rather than operating independently of it. "Before we begin," he said, "we need to assess whether you can follow a direct order. That is the purpose of the assessment, sir. Then consider this the first order." He looked at her uniform jacket. "Take it off," he said. The room went quiet in a way that rooms go quiet when something has shifted from routine to significant. not loud silence. The absence of sound that means everyone present has simultaneously decided to listen very carefully. Sloan did not move. Is that part of the formal evaluation protocol, sir? It is now. She held his gaze for 2 full seconds. She could see from the corner of her vision Dolan's jaw tighten by a millimeter. Could see Harlow near the back wall go very still. Could see Pelham watching Hargrove the way men watch someone they believe is about to win something. She thought about Alvarez, 23 years old, 7 minutes, 14 people who said nothing. Then she took off her jacket. She did it slowly, deliberately. Not in the way of someone complying with a demand, in the way of someone choosing to reveal something. The distinction was significant, and she understood that the room would feel it even if they couldn't name what they were feeling. She folded the jacket over her left arm, and the room saw her left shoulder, the trident, the Navy Special Warfare insignia, the eagle and the anchor and the flintlock pistol, and the trident tattooed in black on the upper deltoid of her left arm, placed there 8 years ago at a ceremony in Coronado after Bud/S after SQ, T after the process that less than 1% of the people who attempt it will complete. The silence that followed was a different kind than the one before it. This one had weight. Hargrove's face went through several stages: confusion, then recognition, then the rapid calculation of a man who has just realized the room he believed he controlled has changed geometry around him. Sloan looked at him steadily. "Sir," she said, her voice even and unhurried, "you just ordered a Navy SEAL to strip." Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Pelham had gone very still behind Hargrove's shoulder. Dolan was looking at the floor, not the floor of a man avoiding the situation, but the floor of a man taking a moment before he decided what to do with something. Harlow in the back of the room was watching Sloan with an expression that was not surprise. It was closer to confirmation, the face of a man who had suspected something and was watching it arrive. Hargrove said, "You're Team 7, Sloan said. 8 years. She let that sit. Then, "Anything else you'd like me to remove, sir?" Hargrove's mouth closed. What happened next was not visible in any movement any of the 11 people in the room made. It happened in the redistribution of something less tangible, the shared wordless understanding that what everyone had believed about the next hour had just been revised. Sloan watched it move through the room. She had seen it before in other rooms in other contexts when the actual nature of a situation finally arrived for people who had been operating on a different assumption. It never took long. It never required announcement. Then she stepped forward, close enough that only Hargrove could hear, close enough that the space between them was a deliberate choice rather than an accident of position. She said quietly and without heat, "You voted no. 4 years after you set the base record here, you sat on Panel C at Coronado, and you voted no on Thomas Voss's daughter. 2015. Hargrove went very still. "I found the letter," she said. "He never told me himself, but he wrote it down." She stepped back to her original position before anyone in the room registered that she had moved. What crossed Hargrove's face in that half-second before he reassembled his expression was not guilt. Men like Hargrove did not carry guilt the way other people did. What she saw was something more precise, the recognition that the room had changed around him in a way he had not controlled, and that the person responsible was someone he had believed 9 years ago would never be standing in front of him at this level. She looked at him steadily. She did not need him to respond. The response was already on his fuss, and it was enough. He said in a voice kept carefully level, "Move to the appeasement grounds." It was the only thing he could say. Sloan put her jacket back on. She buttoned it with the same deliberate calm she had shown, taking it off the exact same pace as if the interval between removal and replacement had been simply a parenthesis in a conversation still ongoing. Then she looked at him. Just looked. Not challenging, not triumphant, with the quality of someone who has a great deal of patience and no need to spend it quickly. "Lead the way, sir," she said. The group moved toward the door. Dolan fell in near the back of the formation. As they filed into the corridor, he passed close enough to Sloan that only she could have heard him. He didn't say anything, but he looked at the trident on her shoulder for exactly 1 second. Then he looked ahead. That was all. But from Dolan, she was already beginning to understand all was sometimes considerable. Outside, the mountain was still there. The altitude was the same as it had been an hour ago, pressing down at 5,800 feet, thinning everything out, requiring the body to work a little harder for the same result. Sloan Lone walked into the cold air and breathed it in. Her father had trained here once, had run this ground, had pressed his boots into this same soil nearly 30 years before she had. She didn't know that yet. She would find out soon enough. Part 2, The Reckoning. The training grounds at Fort Carson occupied 11 acres north of Building 7, bounded on the west by a chain-link fence, and on the east by a tree line that stopped abruptly where the base engineers had cleared it for sightlines. The obstacle course ran along the northern perimeter, a 300-meter loop that included a 12-foot wall, a tire-run, a rope climb, a low crawl section through compacted mud, and a final sprint across open ground to the timing gate. It was early November. The ground was frozen in patches. The air had the quality of high-altitude cold that doesn't announce itself loudly but accumulates in the joints and the lungs, over time a slow tax the body pays without being asked. Sergeant First Class Vic Dolan stood at the timing gate with a stopwatch and the expression of a man who had seen enough evaluations to have stopped expecting anything surprising from them. He had been running assessments for 6 years. In 6 years, he had seen the full range of what the human body was capable of on a standardized obstacle course, and the range was narrower than most people wanted to believe. Elite performers existed, but elite performers had something about them before they ran a relationship with their own body that showed in the way they stood at the start line, in the way they studied the course rather than looked at it, in the absence of the unconscious preparatory adjustments that average athletes made without knowing they were making them. He watched Sloan Voss stand at the start line. He said nothing. He started the clock. The 12-foot wall came first. She hit it with both hands at shoulder height and went over it in a single motion, not climbing, but transitioning the way you move through a space when the space is irrelevant and the other side is what matters. She landed on the balls of her feet and was moving before the landing had finished. 4 seconds for the wall. The tire run was next 16 tires laid in 2 offset rows across 12 meters of frozen ground. She went through them at full speed without looking down. Looking down is a corrective action. It means your feet are making decisions your eyes haven't finished making yet. Not looking down meant the spacing had been solved before she entered it. Through in 6 seconds. The rope climb was 20 feet of 1-inch hemp with no knots. She went up hand over hand without using her legs, which was 3 times harder and roughly twice as fast. And at the top, she tagged the steel bar, came down in a controlled descent, and was running again before Dolan had fully processed what he had just watched. He was aware of Hargrove standing 30 meters to his left. He did not look at Hargrove. The low crawl section was 30 meters of compacted mud under wire strung 18 inches off the ground. She went through it flat and efficient, her profile consistently below the wire, without the micro adjustments most trainees made when they misjudged clearance. No wasted motion. The kind of crawl that came from doing it in the dark in conditions where the wire was replaced by something that would do more damage if you touched it. She came out of the mud already accelerating. That was when Dolan saw Pelham move. Lieutenant Craig Pelham had positioned himself near the edge of the mud pit with both hands at his sides, the posture of a man trying to look like he wasn't doing anything. Dolan had seen that posture before in the 3 months he had served under Hargrove on 2 previous evaluations where candidates that Hargrove had decided against had encountered complications in the later stages of the course. Complications that appeared accidental, that were assessed as accidental, that Dolan had filed away in a growing inventory he had not yet found a use for. Pelham had something in his right hand held low against his thigh, a 1/2-inch steel rod, the kind used as a ground stake for temporary fencing, about 18 inches long. Sloan came out of the mud at full speed. Pelham stepped forward. She stopped, not slowed, stopped, as if a machine running at maximum output had been paused. Her boots skidded 2 inches across frozen dirt, and she was standing still upright, balanced with Pelham 4 feet in front of her, and the rod now visible as his arm came forward. The intention and the execution had been separated by something he hadn't expected her stopping. For a moment, nobody moved. Then Sloane's right hand came out. It was not a large movement. It was fast in the sense that it was finished before anyone watching had fully registered it had begun. Her hand closed around the rod, a rotation of her wrist, not a pull or redirect using the grip and the angle, and the rod was no longer in Pelham's hand. She held it for 1 second, looked at him, set the rod on the ground with the same absence of emphasis she might have used to put down a coffee cup. Then she ran. Dolan clicked the stopwatch at the timing gate. He looked at the number. He looked at it again. Staff Sergeant Cruz, the duty instructor. 4 years at the post, a reputation for precision, stepped to Dolan's shoulder and looked at the display. Cruz said quietly, 2 minutes and 4 seconds. Dolan was quiet. Cruz said, the previous post record is 2:47. I know what the record is. Cruz chose his next words carefully. That's not for a first run on an unfamiliar course, sir. Write it down, Dolan said. Cruz wrote it down. Sloane stood at the timing gate with her hands on her knees for 4 seconds of recovery interval. So brief it was almost insulting, then straightened and looked at Hargrove. Hargrove's face had the quality of a man who had been shown something he intended to dispute, but hadn't yet found the mechanism for disputing it. "Firearms next," he said. His voice was even. He was good at even. Sloane nodded and followed the group toward the range. She did not look at Pelham. Pelham retrieved the rod from the ground. Nobody helped him. Nobody acknowledged the moment at all, which was its own form of acknowledgement. Dolan noted it. That was the second time. The range at Fort Carson's Northern Training Facility was a standard single-lane configuration, 50 meters, 25 meters, and close quarters at 10, with target frames that could run moving or stationary. Crews set the sequence to moving, which was the harder configuration. Sloane was handed a standard-issue M18 service pistol by the range officer. She took it with her right hand, transferred it briefly to her left, while she checked the chamber and the magazine well, then transferred it back and settled into her stance. Dolan watched her grip. He had qualified expert marksman in 2009, 2012, 2014, and each subsequent year. He understood firearms at the level of someone who had trained with them long enough that the technical language had dissolved into instinct, and what remained was pattern recognition, the ability to see in the way someone held a weapon, the full history of how they had learned to use it. Sloane's grip was not the current standard two-handed thumbs-forward configuration that had been doctrine for 15 years. It was older. Was a modified isosceles with a slightly higher thumb placement on the support hand, common in certain specialized training environments in the late 90s and early 2000s, the kind of thing passed down through direct instruction rather than formal curriculum, because formal curriculum had moved on. It was the grip of someone taught by someone who had learned it a generation earlier. The targets began moving. She hit the first one moving, crossing left to right at 25 meters center mass, then the second, then the third, which was moving at an angle rather than laterally, requiring a different calculation. She adjusted without pause. By the seventh target, the range officer had stopped making notes and was simply watching. She ran the full sequence. Every shot center mass. The grouping when crews pulled the targets was tight enough that several holes overlapped. Crews looked at the paper for a long time. He did not speak. Hargrove said, "Show off," almost to himself, the word carrying a tone, trying for dismissal, but landing closer to frustration. Dolan was 3 meters away. He heard it. He also noticed that Hargrove was not looking at the target. He was looking at Sloane. What was on his face was not the irritation of a man watching someone perform above expectations. It was something more personal than that, something with history behind it. Dolan had been reading senior officers for 14 years. He knew the difference between professional displeasure and the kind that came from somewhere older. He filed it. Third time now. The hand-to-hand assessment took place in the gymnasium on the west side of the training grounds, polished concrete, fluorescent lighting, the permanent smell of old sweat that no cleaning schedule has ever fully removed. Blue wrestling mats covered the central area. Hargrove announced the matchup. "Pelham," he said. Pelham stepped onto the mat. 6'1", 215. The build of a man who lifted with the intention of being seen. He looked at Sloane with the expression of a man who believed this was already over. Sloane walked to the center of the mat and pulled her hair back without taking her eyes off him. It was a small thing, a preparatory thing. It also communicated without a word that she was not thinking about his size. She was thinking about the match. They squared off. Cruz gave the signal. Pelham came forward with more aggression than technique. She stepped and left, let his momentum pass on her right side, and placed her hand on his shoulder as he went by a light redirection, barely contact. He stumbled, caught himself, turned. He was faster than he looked. She gave him that. He came again, lower this time, aiming for a double-leg takedown. She sprawled, hips dropping back, weight shifting forward onto his shoulders, using his momentum to redirect his face toward the mat. He caught himself on his forearms before impact. They separated and reset. Across the room, Dolan had his arms crossed. He was not watching Pelham. He was watching Sloane's footwork, the weight distribution between exchanges, the slight angle she maintained, keeping her right side forward, the way she tracked Pelham's hands rather than his face. It was the footwork of someone trained in a system designed for real conditions rather than competition, built to end things rather than score points. Pelham was breathing harder than she was. He knew it. The third exchange was different. He came in controlled, smarter than the first two, and went for the collar of her jacket rather than trying to take her down immediately. His right hand found fabric. His left arm came around in a clinch tighter than the parameters of a supervised assessment required, and when the leverage reached its limit, he pulled and rotated simultaneously. Sloan heard it before she felt it. A pop, deep in the left shoulder joint. The sound of something that had moved past the boundary of where it was designed to go. The pain arrived immediate and specific. Not the diffuse ache of muscle strain, but the precise, sharp signal of structural compromise. She had heard that sound twice before in two different operational contexts, and she knew what it meant about the next months of her life before the sensation had finished arriving. She did not make a sound. What she did instead was use the half-second that Pelham spent registering what he had done his own surprise to complete the movement he had initiated for her. She rotated with his torque rather than against. It dropped her weight and redirected him past her. He hit the mat face first. Before he had oriented himself, she had his right arm secured and her knee positioned at the base of his spine. The joint lock was applied at 10% of what she could have applied it at. She said, "Tap." Pelham said nothing. He was processing. The position. The fact that he could not move without a very specific kind of pain. She applied another 5%. He tapped the mat with his free hand, fast, 3 times. She released him and stood. The shoulder was a steady, insistent presence. She knew Hargrove was watching her face for evidence of it. She gave him nothing. She stood straight, which cost her something, and looked at the center of the room rather than at anyone in it. Cruz noted the completion time. Hargrove said nothing. Pelham got up, favoring the wrong side. He had taken the shoulder as a result of her finishing the exchange and had no consciousness of having caused damage in return. Sloan didn't tell him. The promise was still intact. She had used the minimum required to complete a legitimate objective. The distinction mattered even though she was the only one in the room who would know to draw it. She breathed out through her nose slowly and waited for what came next. What came next was a hallway and then an office. Hargrove told the group there would be a 30-minute break before the administrative component. Then he turned to Sloan with the casualness of a man flagging something as insignificant to ensure it didn't seem significant, and said he needed a moment with the applicant. She followed him to his office on the second floor of Building 7. The office communicated what it had been arranged to communicate. Degrees on the wall, all framed in the same dark wood. A photograph of Hargrove with a senator at an event where everyone in the image was performing their relationship to power. An American flag in the corner, cased and then uncased and displayed in the manner of formal honor. Hargrove sat behind the desk. Sloan sat across from him. He opened a folder and turned it so she could read it. No drama, no preamble. The way you present something you believe speaks for itself. The document was 4 pages. She read the first 2 paragraphs of the first page and understood its shape. A formal allegation. The language was precise, which meant someone with legal training had helped draft it either now or in anticipation of exactly this situation. The allegation she had violated confidentiality protocols of a classified assessment by self-identifying as a Navy SEAL before any operational necessity required the disclosure, constituting a breach of mission parameters that voided the legitimacy of the current evaluation. A secondary allegation regarding conflict of interest arising from her personal relationship with Rear Admiral Calloway, framed in the language of institutional review rather than accusation, but carrying the same functional weight. The document concluded with a suggestion framed as professional courtesy that she voluntarily withdraw from the assessment to avoid the formal investigation that would otherwise be initiated. She read it all the way through. Then she looked up. Hargrove was watching her with the expression of a man who had played enough of these conversations to know how they usually went. People got defensive. They argued. They made the mistake of treating the document as a debate rather than what it was, which was a lever. The shoulder was a steady, insistent presence. She was very aware of it and was giving none of that awareness to her face. She said, "Are you done, Colonel?" Hargrove blinked. "The document," she said, "is that the complete version?" "That's the complete version." "Then yes," she said, "I'm done reading." She did not pick up the folder. She did not lean forward or back. She sat with the stillness of someone for whom stillness is not the absence of movement, but the presence of decision. "I'm not withdrawing," she said. Hargrove's expression shifted in a way small enough to miss if you weren't paying attention. Not surprised he hadn't expected to resolve this in one conversation. What it was, she thought, was the recognition that this was going to require a different approach. "You understand what a formal investigation means for your record?" "Yes." "You understand that the outcome, regardless of the final determination, has a way of defining how a file looks?" "Yes." "And you're still not withdrawing?" She looked at him for one moment longer than was comfortable. "No," she said. "Sir." The word was correct in form and empty of everything form usually carried. She stood. He had not dismissed her, but she stood anyway, and he did not tell her to sit back down. The administrative component, she said. What room, he told her. She left. In the hallway moving toward the stairs, she allowed herself 3 full seconds to feel the shoulder, its depth. The range of motion already lost the calculation of what the next conversation with a flight surgeon was going to contain. 6 months. Conservative estimate, optimistic scenario. Then she put it aside and walked. Corporal Dex Harlow found her 20 minutes later. She was in a secondary corridor on the first floor, a connecting passage between two wings that most people used only to cut through. She had gone there because the shoulder required a moment of privacy that other spaces didn't offer. She heard him before she saw him. Not because he was loud, because she was listening, and because the way he moved in buildings was different from the way most people moved. Quieter in a way that was trained rather than natural. Harlow came around the corner and stopped when he saw her. He was 25 years old, but his eyes were older. He had the quality of someone who had been paying attention to things that most people his age hadn't yet learned required attention. He was not surprised to find her there. She thought he had looked for her specifically. He held a folder at his side. Thin, dark blue cover, no markings. He looked at her for a moment. Not at the shoulder, though she believed he had noticed it. At her face. Then he held the folder out. She took it. The first page was a log. Dates in the left column, incidents in the middle, names on the right, names of soldiers and junior officers, some she recognized from Calloway's preliminary briefing materials, some she didn't. The log ran for 14 months. The handwriting was small and careful, the kind that comes from someone who had decided accuracy mattered, and the record needed to stand on its own without interpretation. She turned to the second page, and the third. It was everything, not in the dramatic sense of a single decisive piece of evidence. In the more meaningful sense, the accumulation of 14 months of documented behavior, patient, and specific, the kind of documentation that understood the difference between allegation and record. She looked up at Harlow. He said nothing. She said, "How long have you been doing this?" "Since April of last year." "Alone?" "Yes, ma'am." A beat of silence. "Did anyone know?" He looked at her steadily. "No, ma'am." She closed the folder. She looked at this young man, 25 years old, a corporal's insignia, a thin service file, 14 months of careful solitary work on a colonel who was the highest authority in the building and who did not respond gently to people who attracted his attention. She said, "Why?" He was quiet for a moment, not because he didn't have an answer, because he was deciding how much of it to give. Then he said, "Because somebody had to." She held the folder. Down the corridor, a door opened and closed, footsteps moving away from them. She said, "Thank you, Corporal." He nodded once, turned and went back the way he had come quietly and was gone. She stood in the corridor for a moment longer. The folder was light in her hand. 14 months weighed less than she expected. Hargrove had spent 3 years and 2 months at Fort Carson, building something he believed was unassailable. He had used the institution the way people who are skilled at institutions use them, accumulating goodwill in the right places, positioning allies in channels where reports slowed and lost their urgency, building the kind of structural insulation that turns consequences into delays. Harlow had spent 14 months building something else. There was a difference between leverage and record. Leverage was a tool of the moment. Record was something else entirely. Record was the kind of thing that once entered did not require anyone to argue for it. It simply existed. It accumulated. It waited. She secured the folder under her right arm and walked back toward the assessment room. The final administrative phase took place at the long table in room 14, the same briefing room where the morning had started. Sloan sat at one end, Hargrove sat at the other. Dolan Cruz and 2 other officers occupied the seats between them. The administrative phase was on paper a structured interview assessing command decision-making under ambiguous conditions. Hargrove asked the questions, she answered them. She answered them correctly, which she could see was not what he had arranged the afternoon to produce. By the 4th question, he had stopped looking at his notes. He was looking at her. She could see him calculating. She knew the difference between someone working through a problem they believed they could solve and someone beginning to understand they cannot. The shift was not dramatic. It rarely was. It happened in the eyes, in the pace of the next question, in the almost imperceptible reduction in the certainty with which the questions were delivered. The questions continued for 22 minutes. At the end of the 22 minutes, Hargrove said, "We'll have a preliminary evaluation summary within 24 hours. The language of adjournment, the language of someone who intended to use those 24 hours for something." Sloan reached into the interior pocket of her jacket. She set the envelope on the table. Standard military correspondence sealed, no exterior markings except a document control number in the upper right corner. I was asked to deliver that at the conclusion of the assessment, she said. Hargrove looked at the envelope. He did not reach for it. He looked at it the way you look at something you already suspect contains a problem you are not ready to have. Then he looked at Sloane, and in his face for the first time since that morning, there was something that was not calculation. He had known she was coming. The alert had reached him 3 days ago through a contact in the administrative processing chain, a name a mission type enough to understand that the woman arriving under the name Claire Merritt was not what her file suggested. He had known before she walked through the door. He had known when she was standing at the start line, when she was on the range, when she sat across from him in his office. He had known, and he had continued anyway, because the people who had helped him before had never failed him before, because the chain of report ran through channels where he had accumulated enough goodwill and enough leverage to slow things down, redirect things, make them complicated enough that the final product arrived somewhere inconvenient and sat there long enough to lose its urgency. That was how it worked. He had used it before. He had watched it work. But the envelope was on the table, and she was looking at him with the gray eyes of a woman who had sat in a hallway at Coronado at 18 years old and had come back 9 years later with a trident on her shoulder and 14 months of documentation in a blue folder that he did not yet know existed. Dolan reached forward and picked up the envelope. Not Hargrove. Dolan. He turned it over, read the document control number, and set it in front of Hargrove. Hargrove opened it. He read the first paragraph. The room was very quiet. Outside, the wind had picked up off the mountain, pressing against the windows in irregular intervals. The fluorescent light hummed at a frequency just below conscious notice. Someone down the corridor closed the door. Hargrove read to the end of the first page. Then he set it face down on the table and looked at the middle distance, the look of a man performing the final accounting of a situation he could no longer alter. Sloane waited. She was very good at waiting. Her father had taught her that most situations resolved themselves if you gave them enough silence and did not reach for them prematurely. She gave this one the silence it needed. Then she stood. She placed Harlow's blue folder on the table beside the envelope. Supplementary documentation, she said. 14 months. You'll want your counsel to review it before your first meeting with the investigation board. Hargrove looked at the folder. He did not touch it. She said, "That's everything, sir." Then she walked to the door and left the room. Part 3, the record. The envelope contained 3 pages. The first was a directive from the Office of the Chief of Naval Operations routed through Naval Special Warfare Command and countersigned by Rear Admiral Calloway, authorizing the evaluation of leadership conduct and command culture at Fort Carson's Elite Tactical Leadership Program under the provisions of DoD Instruction 6400.11, which governed command climate assessments in the protocols by which their findings were to be reported, preserved, and acted upon. The second page was a summary of preliminary assessment findings, preliminary, because preliminary was all that was required at this stage. Preliminary was enough. The third page was a list of 11 names. Hargrove's was at the top. Pelham's was fourth. There were 9 others, each with a corresponding notation, each notation a specific date and incident cross-referenced to a file number that existed in a system he could not access and could not alter. The officers around the table had understood by the third page that something in the architecture of their afternoon had changed irreversibly. They understood it the way people understand structural changes, not through announcement, but through the shift in atmosphere, the quality of a room after something load-bearing has given way. Cruz was very still at the far end. Dolan had his hands flat on the table. Not folded, not clenched flat. The posture of a man who has decided to be present for what comes next without contributing to it before it arrives. Hargrove said, "This isn't," and stopped. He tried again. The process for a formal assessment of this kind requires a minimum notification period of the notification period. Sloane said from the doorway she had not gone far because she had known this part was coming, is documented in Section 3 of the directive. The assessment was conducted within the authorized framework. The findings are preliminary and will be completed within 30 days. She came back into the room and stood. He was sitting. The geometry was no longer what it had been when the afternoon began. "I want to speak to Admiral Calloway directly," he said. "You can submit that request through the standard command channel. It will be logged." Pelham at the far side of the table made a sound that might have been the beginning of something. Nobody looked at him. "Effective immediately is the language they used," Hargrove said. "Yes, sir." "My training authority." "Suspended pending the investigation." "Yes, sir." A silence with real duration. Dolan was looking at the table, but he had moved his right hand slightly, A small adjustment, the kind that meant he had made a decision about something and was done deliberating. Hargrove said, "You came here knowing this was going to happen." It was not quite a question. Sloan said, "I came here to conduct an assessment, Colonel. What happened here today happened because of choices made in this building, not by me. You set this up." "No, sir." She said it without rancor, without performance. "You did. I just showed up." Then she turned and walked to the door, and this time she did not stop. Behind her, the room remained silent. The ventilation hummed. The wind pressed at the windows from the direction of the mountain. Down the corridor, a phone rang twice and stopped. Nobody in room 14 moved for a long time. The air outside Building 7 was cold in the way of late afternoon at high altitude. Sharper than the morning had been the light coming in low off the Rockies, turning the training ground a color between gold and gray. The flagpole at the center of the parade ground cast a shadow that had moved 45 degrees since her arrival. She had been inside for most of a full day. She stopped at the bottom of the steps and breathed in through her nose. Her father had done this too, the conscious, complete breath in a new environment, the way of grounding yourself in a place by first taking something of it inside. She had learned it from watching him before she had understood it was a thing to learn. The shoulder was worse than an hour ago, which was expected. The immediate injury always felt manageable in the moment because adrenaline and focus were efficient pain, suppression systems, and what remained after both had metabolized was the true accounting. She moved her left arm slightly, testing range. The range confirmed what the sound in the gymnasium had already told her. She had known this was coming when she chose not to tap out. She had made that choice. She did not regret it, which was different from not feeling it. A private first class she didn't know crossed the parade ground 20 meters to her left, moving quickly, head down against the wind. To him, she was simply an officer standing at the bottom of steps at the end of the day, which was an unremarkable thing to be. She walked toward the medical station. The medical station occupied a low building near the compound's southern entrance. The flight surgeon on duty was a lieutenant colonel named Keating, 50s, as spare in his movements with the economy of someone who had worked in places where time was a clinical variable and not a courtesy. He examined the shoulder in silence for 3 minutes. He asked her to move her arm through 4 ranges of motion. She completed 2. At the third, the signal moved from discomfort into the register that indicated structural involvement rather than muscular, and she stopped. He said, "When did it happen?" She told him. He said, "You finished the assessment." Not a question. "Yes." He made a note. Then a acromioclavicular joint, grade 2, possibly 3, imaging will confirm. Surgery is likely. Return to full-duty, conservative estimate 6 months. That assumes you don't push the rehabilitation and the imaging doesn't show additional involvement. Understood. He looked at her for a moment with the attention of a physician trying to determine whether understood meant accepted or something more complicated. She looked back at him steadily. He wrote the referral and handed it to her. She took it with her right hand. Outside the medical station, the light had dropped further. The mountain was in shadow, the peak still lit somewhere above the cloud line, but the base of it gone dark. The temperature had fallen 4 or 5 degrees since the afternoon, the kind of drop that happened fast at altitude when the sun angle changed. She had 20 minutes before the vehicle arrived. She walked the perimeter road north along the fence line, not because she had anywhere to go, but because movement helped the shoulder more than standing still did, and because she wanted the open air for a few minutes before the confined space of the vehicle and the long drive to the airport. The training ground was empty now. The obstacle course was a set of shapes in the diminishing light, the wall a dark rectangle, against the pale sky the rope hanging slack, the tire run reduced to a series of low circles she could barely distinguish from this distance. She had run that course this morning. She would not run it again for at least 6 months. That was the key. She had known there would be one. She had not known its exact shape then, and now she did. 6 months, 1 surgery, 1 rehabilitation. The better part of a year from the moment Pelham's grip had exceeded what the joint was designed to absorb. She did not try to make the cost smaller than it was. She let it be the size it was. Her father had done the same. She had watched him move through the recovery from 2 surgeries and a fracture, and the accumulated wear of a body asked to operate at the extreme of its capacity for 30 years. He had never pretended those things were smaller than they were. He had also never made them larger. He had simply moved through them. She heard footsteps on the perimeter road behind her. She knew it was Dolan before she turned around. Not from expectation, but from recognition. She had spent the day learning the particular weight distribution of how he moved, the sound of a man who had carried heavy loads over long distances, long enough that the adjustment had become permanent. He fell into step beside her. They walked without speaking. The compound was quiet around them. The day's activity had concluded, and the end-of-day transition had passed, and what remained was the stillness of a military installation in the hour before the watch change, never empty, but in the register between one thing and the next. Dolan said, "Hell of a day." She said, "Yes." He said nothing for 20 meters. Then heard your father was Thomas Voss. She said, "Yes, sir." He was quiet for a moment. They walked. Served with him, Coronado, 98. He looked ahead at the fence line at whatever existed at that specific distance. Just a workup cycle. 6 months. I was still in the conventional side doing a liaison attachment. A pause. He was the kind of man you don't forget. Not because he said much. The opposite. Because what he said was right, and he'd already decided it needed saying before he opened his mouth. She said nothing. He said, "I heard about the shoulder. News travels. Small post." He walked another few steps. "You didn't stop." "No." "Good," and he said, not as an endorsement of the injury, as a recognition of the decision of the specific choice to honor the obligation over the personal cost. The language of a man who understood from his own inventory of such choices why that distinction mattered. They reached the corner of the perimeter road where it turned south toward the main entrance. The vehicle pickup point was 200 meters in that direction. Dolan stopped. She stopped. He turned to face her. He extended his hand. Not the performed handshake of official occasions. The handshake of someone who has decided a person deserves to have their hand shaken, that the gesture is the most accurate expression of a thing that does not require elaboration. She took it. His grip was firm and brief and entirely without theater. He said, "Good man." 2 words. Not a reference to gender or its absence, the highest designation in the lexicon of the community, they both in their different ways inhabited. The vocabulary of a tradition built by people who understood the designation had nothing to do with biology and everything to do with conduct. She said, "Thank you, Sergeant Major." He nodded once. Then he turned and walked back the way he had come along the perimeter road toward the compound without looking back. She watched him for a moment. Then she turned and walked south toward the pickup point. The vehicle was a black government SUV with dark windows and no markings. The driver was a young petty officer, second class, named Whitfield, who got out when he saw her coming and stood at attention until she told him before he had fully extended the position to get back in. He held the rear door. She got in. He closed it, went around, started the engine. The heater came on, and the air inside the vehicle was suddenly close and warm after the cold of the perimeter road and the windows fogged at the edges in the way of heated glass against cold air. The compound moved past as they pulled forward a barracks block, a motor pool, the medical station, the administrative annex building 7, with its lights coming on one by one as the daylight withdrew. Whitfield said, "Ma'am, everything good?" She was looking at the compound through the glass. "Better than expected," she said. He pulled toward the main gate. She reached into the inside pocket of her jacket. The photograph was 4 inches by 6 inches, printed on the matte paper standard for service photographs in the 90s, folded once at some point in its history, and then unfolded and never folded again, so a crease crossed the lower third that had softened with age into something more like a contour than a line. Her father. In his seal dress uniform standing at Coronado, she recognized the building behind him, had stood in front of it herself on a different day in a different year. He was 26 in this photograph, 1 year younger than she was today. She had not noticed that discrepancy when she first found it in the shoebox, but she noticed it now with the clarity that sometimes came at the end of difficult days. He was looking directly at the camera. Not smiling, not unsmiling, simply present. The way he had always been present in photographs, as in life, without performing anything for the frame. His left shoulder was toward the camera. At the edge of the uniform collar, just visible the top of the trident tattoo. The same shoulder. The same mark. The vehicle passed through the main gate, past the guard station, and out onto the road running south. The mountain was behind them now, invisible in the darkness, but present the way things are present when you have stood at the base of them and know their weight. She held the photograph. She thought about Dolan's handshake, about Harlow's 14 months of careful, solitary work in a building where that work could have cost him everything, about Cruz standing at the timing gate looking at a number that didn't fit inside his existing understanding of what was possible. She thought about the weight of the trident, which was not metaphorical, the physical insignia placed in your hands at the completion of the program, gold-colored metal, approximately 4 ounces, which you felt in your palm before you felt anything else. Her father had felt it. She had felt it. That was not nothing. It was in fact precisely everything. The highway appeared ahead. Whitfield took the on-ramp and accelerated to speed. The lights of Colorado Springs spread to the east. To the west, darkness where the mountains were. Her phone buzzed once against her leg. She looked at the screen. Calloway. She answered. Calloway said without greeting, without preamble, the way she said everything that needed saying, "How's the shoulder manageable?" Keating said 6 months. That's what he said. A pause on the line. Not empty. Calloway did not do empty pauses. This one had something in it, the quality of someone who has made a decision and is choosing the right moment to deliver it. Calloway said, "There's another post, Fort Ridgeway, South Carolina. Different command, same pattern. It's been running longer than Carson." Sloan looked out the window. The plains were dark on both sides, flat and wide, and running out to where the sky started. She said, "Timeline, assessment window opens in 7 months. 1 month past your medical clearance if recovery goes to schedule." Tight. Yes. Another pause. Calloway said, "I'm not ordering you." Sloan said, "I know." She looked at the photograph in her hand. Her father, 26 years old, standing at Coronado before she could walk. The trident at his shoulder. The straight-ahead look of a man not performing anything for the frame. She thought about the line in the report. The one Calloway had read 72 hours from now in Norfolk, sitting at her desk with the Atlantic gray outside her window. The footnote the duty officer had attached, because duty officers at that level were trained to flag anomalies. 2 minutes, 4 seconds. Previous record, Master Chief Thomas Voss, 1997. His daughter. She thought about what Calloway had said to her earlier that afternoon in the meeting room about her father not talking about her at work. Carrying it alone. Wanting what she was building to be hers. It was hers, the record included. And so was this the phone in her hand, the conversation she was in the middle of the road ahead, running straight and dark toward the airport, and the flight in Virginia Beach, in the 6 months waiting on the other side of a flight surgeon's calendar. All of it hers, all of it earned. She said, "Send me the file." Calloway said, "Already sent. Get some rest." The line went quiet. Sloan set the phone on the seat beside her. She looked at the photograph for one more moment. Then she placed it carefully in the interior pocket of her jacket on the left side over the shoulder that was going to require surgery and 6 months of work before it would do what she asked of it again. Close. Outside, the highway ran straight and dark all the way to the horizon. She settled back in the seat. 6 months. 1 month of buffer. South Carolina, Fort Ridgeway. Same pattern. Running longer than Carson. She was already thinking about it. She closed her eyes not to sleep, but to begin. The way her father had taught her to start any mission worth starting from. Stillness, from breath, from the deliberate act of letting what you know settle before you reach for what you don't. The vehicle moved through the dark. The mountain was behind her now, out of sight, going about the business of being a mountain. It had been there before she arrived and would be there long after she left. But she had been here. She had run the ground. She had left something on it. That was, her father would have said, entirely the point.